Yes.
Woohoo!
They're now starting the slideshow. Good. Technology, joys of technology. Anyway, hello. I am Helen Cullis. I am a passionate data governance professional, and I've worked in data in one guise or another, pretty much my whole career. My grounding was actually in medical research, with the wonderful stick with some of the doctors that if you didn't get the data right, well, you could kill a patient. I now work in finance, where you're going to lose someone's money, which is still important, but you're not going to kill someone. So the argument is slightly more nuanced nowadays. So I've been working formally in data governance itself for nearly 5 years now. And I'm here today to give you an introduction to data governance, what it is, what it isn't, why it's so important, what the key areas are, what makes up what we call a data governance framework, which I'll explain what that is, and why and what skills are important for this. So what is data governance? Which I'm really hoping the slide's going to change. There we go. So here is a beautiful, tidy wardrobe. So imagine your company is the wardrobe. So as many of you who have children or teenagers will probably know the bomb site that a lot of children and teenagers' rooms are. Imagine that, but imagine it then beautifully and wonderfully organized. The teenagers' room is actually what most companies look like when you look at their data and you think about it. Data governance is about going from that to this kind of wardrobe, where it's beautifully arranged, you know where everything is, all the shoes are together, all the belts are together, all the scarves are together, the data is easy to find, it's accessible, it's of high quality, you're only keeping what you need to, you're not keeping that tatty pair of jeans with rips everywhere that you don't ever wear anymore. And you are also eliminating human error where possible by removing manual processes. And you have one version of the truth or trust. So you know exactly what that piece of data is for that particular customer, for example. You know what their postcode is. You haven't got 6 versions of it because each of your systems isn't talking to each other properly or updating. So the benefits of getting to the tidy wardrobe is why data governance is so important. Everyone talks nowadays about data-driven decision-making, and the ugly truth, to be honest, is that very few companies are actually achieving this. Their data is simply not well enough governed for this to be a reality. I'm sure everyone on this call has heard the old adage, rubbish in, rubbish out. And this means that obviously if you're starting with poor quality data, you're going to end up with meaningless insights and analysis coming out at the end. You'll still get analysis and insights because you can still run statistics on rubbish, but it's not going to tell you what's actually happening. And given the poor quality and frankly and accessibility of a lot of data in companies, many companies would genuinely be better off making decisions based on their business knowledge and acumen that they've built up over the years rather than their data. And this is something not many people like to hear. There's also a big benefit of regulatory compliance in a field like myself, where I work in finance and fintechs, but also everybody has to now comply to GDPR, which is now in its 3rd year, which most people can't quite believe we've already got 3 years of that. So the key fundamental tenet of data governance is that data is a critical corporate asset, and it needs to be recognized as that asset along with your staff and probably the profits or your stock if you're a sort of manufacturing type company. It is that important, and it's getting people to genuinely realize that can be quite challenging sometimes. So the other thing is that data governance cares about all of the data. So we care about every piece of data that is generated in the entire company, not just personal data or business critical data potentially, but the level of governance you apply to the data varies depending on the criticality that you assign that data. So personal data is highly critical because you could get a whopping great fine for mismanaging it. On the other hand, regulatory data or business sensitive data that you don't want a competitor to know, that for a data governance professional is equally as important. So data the other thing to really understand, which I'm sure everyone on this call probably does, is that data is actually everything a company produces. It's your emails, it's your Word documents, it's those random Excel files you got buried everywhere. Those are all data. And this is it's not just the numbers and sort of stuff in the structured systems, it's everything. It's all the paperwork as well. That you might have stored on an offsite storage or in the cupboards in the office, for example. This is what I mean by we care about all the data. It's that broad. And because of this, it's often why the terms data and information are used interchangeably, because people sometimes find it, sort of non-data professionals occasionally find it easier to understand and visualize when you're talking about information. If they say, oh, right, I get an email as a piece of information. They don't see how it's a piece of data, because they think of data as a number. Whereas in my world, as I say, data is everything. So the other thing, so these types of data, is what we call them structured and unstructured data. So broadly speaking, anything in a system that has defined fields, that's a structured system, that is structured data, stuff that we could run reports on. Unstructured data is things on your shared drive, it's things on your emails, it's all of that paperwork that I was talking about. That is your unstructured data, because we don't really have a way of scanning that easily. It's all a bit messy where it's often stored, and especially with paper, there's no way to deal with it other than a human physically looking through it very often. So the other thing is, data governance is not an IT thing, which really bugs me when people say it is. Ideally, what you need for it is it needs data, because it is this critical corporate asset. Data needs a seat at the executive table. If you are truly recognizing it as an asset, why is it not at that exec table? For me, the signaling is sometimes off if it's not. And this is why you have this massive proliferation now of chief data officers, because they are getting that seat at that table, because companies beyond people like Google and Facebook are recognizing that data is an asset, which is fabulous. And it's really where we need to be going with this. But the difficulty with it is that people sometimes view data governance as a project. It is not a project. It will never end. It is an ongoing piece of work that you commit to do in the same way like HR commits to look after the staff. That is very similar to that. The other issue or challenge is that it's not one size fits all. You can't cookie cutter it. You can take some elements and bring them over from another company, and you can sort of cherry pick, but you have to build a data governance framework that is bespoke for your organization, because it has to wrap around it and fit the reality of what is. If you try and fit a cookie cutter on top, it will fail, almost certainly. It just won't work. The only way a cookie cutter would work is potentially if you were starting a new company from the ground up, but you'd have to change it as it went along, as the company grew. So you would end up with a bespoke one anyway. So as I said at the beginning in the introduction, what data governance isn't. So data governance is not data protection or information security. These are two very distinct but very related disciplines. Data protection is the more legal side, and they only care about the personal data of the staff and the customers that a company holds. And they're the ones who will fill in the data subject access request and things like that, and keep something called the Article 30 record for GDPR purposes. This is the record of processing of everyone's data. Then there's information security, which is more around the accessibility and making sure you're sort of safe from hackers and things like that. And also making sure that people only need access to the data that they need to. So that's why often you get that horrible thing every year of, oh, let's review what everyone's access requirements are for all your staff, which can take quite a long time, but it's still a very important piece of work to do. But because especially areas like data governance, which are relatively new, it's only been around as a sort of field for about 10 years or so, there's a lot of grey areas between these three disciplines. And it's why collaboration between the three of them in a company is really important, because you do have that interconnection. I'm going to go on later to talk about things like data retention, which is how long you keep your data for. That requires all three areas to work really closely together, because they all have a vested interest from a slightly different perspective. And I never mind when someone comes in to chat to me and say, oh, can you give me some advice about this? And it's not really my area, because very often it'll be a bit of a gray area. I just want people to come and ask me the question. I don't want them to not ask the question, even if all I do is bounce them to another team. And that's really very much how I like to work with the data protection information security teams, that we work really harmoniously together. So this is a data governance framework. I will acknowledge this fantastic diagram, which, if you see the link at the bottom of the screen, is where I pinched it from, because I've never found a diagram I like more. So this is, broadly speaking, what your data governance framework is. You usually put it in a document and you say basically how your company is going to approach each of the elements in this diagram. This diagram also very handily shows you why there is overlap with data protection and information security, because you have accessibility on there, which I said is more of an information security sort of element. There's also the security element, which is the sort of data protection and information security bit as well. So in the middle, you can see the fundamental tenets of technology, people, and processes, which are very important because you need to have the right tools in place, with the right people and the right knowledge of how to use them, and those processes set out so that people can do repeated tasks and they'll get them right every time. Ownership is also a really fundamental part of it. Who owns the data? Every single piece of data in your company needs to be owned. It can't be a little orphan off without an owner. And I'm going to talk about the principles of data ownership in a bit later. And as I say, there's the accessibility element. People need access to the data they need to do their job. But also, from the other angle, they shouldn't have access to more data than they need to do their job, because otherwise they might be having access to more personal data than they should. And that's how you get privacy by design, which is a fundamental part of data protection in the GDPR. Then there's the security of the data. You need to make sure it's not going to get breached in a hack or something, or in a phishing, for example. You need to make sure that it is safe, because if you've got customer data or staff data, you owe it to those people to look after it. You also don't want your competitors finding out what your next product launch is going to be, because they'll nick it potentially. The quality, as I was saying earlier about the whole rubbish in, rubbish out, it needs to be high. Otherwise, frankly, there's not much point having it. It's just mess, which will take you ages to sort through, and you might be making the wrong decision off. And knowledge fits in with sort of training and communications, and with the people element, because you do need people who are trained in data all over the company, because everyone is using data. As I said, everyone's got emails. We all use emails. We all use instant messaging in our day-to-day lives at work at the moment, things like that. So moving on then to the next slide. So these are the key areas of data governance. So as I talked earlier about the framework, so this is your statement of as is. What are you doing right now? And it doesn't matter initially if this is a bit small, because you need to make a statement of fact of, okay, what are we doing now? What does your approach look like today? Your strategy then is your sort of partner aspirational piece. And if you put them together, you'd have this holistic whole picture of where you are now and where you want to be and how you're going to get there. Underneath that, you obviously usually have policies and processes, etc. The key ones in data governance are nearly always data quality policy and data retention. The data quality one is obviously about how you're going to make sure the quality of your data is as high as possible. And the data retention one is how you're going to not keep all your data forever and ever and ever, and how you meet certain regulatory requirements like GDPR. Do you actually delete all your staff and customer data when you say you do in your privacy notices, for example? There are lots of companies out there, I'll tell you, who aren't actually compliant with their own privacy notices. So then what you can do as part of this strategy and framework sort of piece in terms of the aspirational, you can do something called a maturity assessment. And there's some fantastic sort of peer-reviewed external ones like the DAMA framework, where basically what it is it's usually a scale of 1 to 5. There is my favorite is the first one, which is chaotic, reactive, stable, proactive, and predictive. Now, most companies, if I was to make a generalization, are probably in reactive. Something goes wrong. Oh, we need to fix this. Right, fix that piece of data quality. They don't actively go looking for any of the issues. The only companies, to be honest, which are in predictive are people who their entire business model is data. So that's the Googles and the Facebooks, like I was talking about, because the commitment to move up the levels in the maturity assessment is 18 to 24 months worth of consistent work where you've got the resources and the real cultural drive behind it, because this is a cultural change to get everyone in the company caring about the data. And it's why some of the skills I'm going to talk about on the next slide are really important. And in some ways, it's not your average data role, which I hopefully will become clear in a minute. So the other advantage of these maturity assessments I was talking about is so you get it done, you benchmark yourselves against the model, but you can also benchmark yourself against the peers if you do an external one. You then say, right, I want to be at this level. So what does being at this level look like? And then you map the gap and do the strategy based on how you get in between those two things. So this is why they're really helpful, because they can really lay it down. And you can often pay consultants who are really familiar with the framework to come in and do it for you. Then the next bit, which is really important and sort of goes back to the whole exec element I was talking about, the executive seat, is the committee or council. You can call it, frankly, whatever you like. This is the joy of data governance. There isn't that much set in terms of terminology yet. There are a few bits and pieces. So I've had steering groups, whatever the company wants. Again, it's that bespoke element. And then there's the working groups that you have who are actually going to do a lot of the work and report up into that committee. And that committee will have this oversight of the framework and the strategy. But it fits within it needs to be what fits with the governance structure within the individual companies already. But the membership of this committee or council, when you have one, it needs to be that exec level. It needs to be that decision-making level, because cultural change of this kind needs to be driven from the top down. You really need a very committed executive. It's very hard if you don't, because they are the ones that you need to be going into the meetings with all of their direct reports, asking, right, where's the data? Show me. Or I've looked at this dashboard in advance of our meeting. I have this, and this question. And if that direct report hasn't looked at that also pre that meeting, they will for the next one, because no one wants to go in and sort of be caught on the hoof by their line manager. But also they set by example. They're showing through various different small ways, no, we are committed to data as a critical corporate asset. So we need to make sure we care about it. There's even things you can do. Actually, I'm skipping down to culture now, sorry, in my talk. There's things that you can do, like a lot of companies have staff awards for people who follow the values really well. Why not have one for data has always been my question, if you've looked after it. If it's that, the values kind of covers off the HR sort of people side of, like, we want our people to be adhering to these. So why not for the data if you're expecting them to be a data-driven organization? I also often used to have one-to-ones with the executives, especially if it was a new initiative for data governance, because they're often a bit nervous, or they're not necessarily from a data background, and they need upskilling and they need constant enthusiasm to get them excited and maintain that driving from the top. Then there's obviously reporting and management information, which you pretty much have to do in most things, and for risk management purposes as well. Data governance risk can be a bit hard to quantify, and it is a challenge, because how do you quantify reputational damage from a breach? It's really hard to nail that down, because the effects will be so wide. You'll have loss of trust in the brand. You'll have potentially customers putting in loads of data subject access requests, which will cost you a lot of money. You might even have staff putting in data subject access requests, and boy, do those take a lot of time. So you can do it for certain risks, and you just, need to find what works for that company. Quite often I'll get asked, so, well, what are the standard key risk indicators for data governance? And my answer is, there aren't many. You need to find what works for your company. What is inherently risky for your company? What works? It needs to sort of be more tangible. You can do some of the data quality ones when you're monitoring the data quality at a really high level, when you're at quite a mature scale of data governance. But to be honest, initially, you want the canaries in the coal mine, as I call them. What's going to scare you? So sort of how many errors are staff making in a particular area where, for instance, if they couldn't make the change to the error themselves and they had to log a help desk ticket to look at it, if monitoring that kind of thing, you can see, well, why did it spike suddenly in June, for example? There's lots of things you can do that are bespoke for the company that way. Or I've even had things like, a lot of companies have overnight runs where the data gets moved from one system to another and gets backed up. That can often break because of data quality issues, because the field validation isn't mapped up. For example, in this system you're allowed 16 characters, and in this system you're only allowed 12, and it's a 16 character address. It'll keep trying to move it over, and the system will just have a hissy fit and say no, and the whole overnight run will blow up. And then you've got some poor person having to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to fix it. That's actually quantifiable. How much does it cost to pay that person that much overtime? For example, how long was it the following morning before you could start answering the phones again, for example? So then the next one, which I said, roles and responsibilities. So this goes back to this bit about ownership. So the key thing about data ownership is you can only actually have one person who owns the data. And it needs to be wherever that piece of data flows in the business. So a really great example would be a customer's date of birth, because that's never going to change unless something's gone badly wrong with your data quality. So for instance, the point of entry into the business, so that first point where that customer is entered into your CRM system or whatever, that whoever is the director usually for that area owns that piece of data. It doesn't matter if it then pops to a servicing system. It then doesn't matter if it pops into a data warehouse. That person is ultimately responsible for that piece of data, and they're the ones who have final sign off. The reason for this is you want one person to have sign off and final when you want to make changes. You obviously consult everyone who uses the data along the way, and along the data flow, but you need that one person who is going to sign off, and it needs to be a senior person. It's usually direct reports of execs, that kind of level. Those are your data owners, as we call them. And that is one of the few terms that is pretty standard in data governance. They then get to delegate a whole load of stuff to people called the data stewards. Now, these are the subject matter experts. These are the people that if there's a data quality issue, and say there was a missing field, they would know exactly where to find the data that should be in that field. Or they would be the ones who would look at the data and go, oh, that looks a bit weird. What's happening there? They work with this data day in, day out. They know their stuff. So they are the data stewards, as we call them. And this another one is a bit of a standard term. You then have, you can have data custodians, as is sometimes called, or system owners. Basically, these are the people who can go into the back end of a system and make a change. So this is very often most of IT. They are the ones who will go and make a system change if there needs to be. When I was talking about those two address fields not matching up, they're the ones who go into the second system and extend it. So it was actually 16 characters, for example, not 12. Then my last and favorite role is sort of one I've made up myself, but I know others who've used it. It's called a data guardian. Now, this is one person in the entire organization who has the data's best interests at heart and nothing else. It actually came from Guardians of the Galaxy because I'm a Marvel fan and I thought it was quite fun. But actually, the best way to understand it is a child being given a guardian in a court case. So sometimes a guardian will be assigned to a child and their only role is to take into account and do what's best for that child. They don't care any of the stuff that's going on with the parents or anything else. They make the decision that is best for the child. So that is what the data guardian does. They make the decision that is best for the long term for the data. They sort of personalize the data and in terms of give it a personality, and it's their baby to look after and make sure that the company doesn't do some daft thing like when they're doing a data migration, not migrate everything because it was a bit difficult to migrate that last field. They say, no, we're going to need that later, or it's going to be really difficult to clean up if we don't. They make they're sometimes the one who comes up and says, I'm sorry, I know this is going to cost more and take longer, but it really is in the best interests. So next bit is what we call data glossary, data dictionary, and data lineage. The last two are sort of fairly, they're connected, so I'll deal with them in a minute. Data glossary is basically, imagine like a glossary at the back of a cookery book. It is your business definition for loads of terms that you use in your business. So my last role was with a company that did mortgages mainly. And for example, the way you would do it in the glossary is you'd have mortgage. We define a mortgage to be X. It comes in different types. It comes in buy-to-let, it comes in residential, second charge, etc., etc. And if you've got a nice piece of software, if you click on buy-to-let, it'll take you to the definition for buy-to-let, for example. But the difficult part is the definition must be unique. And the easiest way to describe it is a wonderful lady I work with called Nicola Askham, who is a wonderful data governance consultant. She describes it as, think of when you're writing your definition, tell an alien to find a teaspoon in a cutlery drawer. And that's your unique definition. Pretend they've never seen cutlery of any description before and they've got to find the teaspoon. So you have to tell them it's an implement that is this long, or between this length, between sort of 5 and 10 centimeters, but no more than 20, for example. It has a small oval shaped dip in the end of it, for example. That will lead you to specifically the teaspoon rather than the soup spoon or the dessert spoon or the serving spoon, for example. So then the other part, as I say, is the data dictionary and the data lineage. Data lineage is basically data flow. It allows you to map it, hopefully visually, and you can see, right, date of birth for a customer comes in here into this system, and then will flow to this system, and eventually end up in the data warehouse. So that is when you're making changes where you know who to identify your stakeholders. The data dictionary is field level definitions and really quite detailed ones. So it will be for example, with mortgages on a buy-to-let, the residential address, the address, of the property will be one address, and the correspondence address of the person taking out the mortgage will be different, because you're very rarely allowed to live in a buy-to-let property that you own, because why would you not be having a residential mortgage then? So in that situation, you need to know, well, what is the security address line 1, for example? We define security address line 1 to be this. It is only allowed to contain numerical and text characters. It's not allowed to contain any special symbols. It can only have 0 to 25 characters, for example. But date of birth or something is another way of looking at it as well, is that it can only be numerical. And you can't put a date of birth in that means the customer would be under 18 at the time the mortgage started, because we don't offer mortgages to anyone under 18, for example. So this is the data dictionary, and it really allows you to keep very much on top of your change management. It's amazing once it's in place, but it is one heck of a slog, I'm not going to lie, to get it in place in the first instance. So data quality and data retention, I think I've sort of covered already. As I say, data quality is, you need to have issue management, because no matter how good you eventually will get your data governance, you're always going to come up with data quality issues, because we're humans and we sometimes type with our foreheads, frankly, and there'll be gobbledygook. So you need to have a team and a way of reporting the issues, and a way of doing also trend analysis on them. Do we get a lot more errors reported on a Friday because everyone's bored and just going through and finishing up before the weekend, and that's when they actually report them? Or are we finding all the errors on a Friday? There's things like that you can look at as well. And data retention, as I said, there's a big GDPR element, but there's also a best practice element to it as well, which is the harder sell, I would say, because data storage is cheap, unfortunately, now, especially when you're talking about clouds. Terabytes of data don't cost much. I mean, when we had floppy disks going sky high in an office, yes, you could very visually see, okay, we need to get rid of some of these floppy disks, otherwise we're all going to be walled in to our desks, for example. Whereas if you're cloud storaging it, you can't see it, it's off somewhere. Whereas why are you keeping data that's 10 years old? What possible purpose is it for you? It's just sitting there as creating a cost potentially, and also as a breach risk, because you might not want someone to get hold of that data eventually. And this was one of the areas, as I said, that data protection, information security, and data governance must work really closely together, because they've all got very vested interest in how this is resolved. But it was also fun, because you can kind of be a bit lonely as a data governance professional. You're nearly always the only person in the company doing it. So I've sort of talked already about the cultural elements, so I won't go into too much more detail on that. The only thing I will say about cultural is it's making it real for every person in their individual roles. So when I talk to a team or a department, I'll go with examples prepared from their area. So if I'm talking to, say, one of the receptionists, and they say to me, and I have had this before, a training session, why am I having to have data governance training? I'll say, well, do you handle the post when it arrives? Yes, I do. It's like, there you go. You are handling and managing data. How do you make sure that that post goes to the right person and it's logged in the right way? How do you do the sign in and sign out log for visitors? That's data. You look after that, and that's personal data. So you go along with the examples to make it real for them, and that's a much easier way to get people enthused and to get them interested, and also get them to realize that data is everybody's responsibility. The other thing is to sort of show to them, well, if you don't do this right here, or you type in the postcode incorrectly, this means we won't be able to do a correct regulatory report and we could get a fine. That's why the things like the data flow is really powerful, because you can show people that even though they think their job is a bit small and not sort of a really big important one, I'm not the one sort of up in front of one of the regulators, they can impact what goes to the regulator, and that is really important. The training and communication goes hand in hand with this. You need to make it fun and exciting as well, because data governance can, to non-enthusiasts, feel a tad dry, I would say at times. It's why I use puppets and Lego and Pac-Man and daft things like that in the training, because it's fun and it just makes people a bit more interested. And also I use a bit of psychology in terms of, I tell my team we are unfailingly enthusiastic when we go out and talk to people, because then they associate data governance with enthusiasm. We are also not there with a stick to hit them with. This is the other thing. We are there to help them, and that message needs to be very strong from the off. And when I was talking earlier with the data governance framework about the people element and the knowledge, you can have the cleanest, tidiest data in the world, but if you don't have staff who have the confidence or the knowledge to actually interpret that data correctly, it's no point. So you need to upskill the data literacy and capability of all the staff to the point. I mean, it's obviously a spectrum, so where they need to be, but they will almost certainly need upskilling. And then collaboration, I've already touched on. You need a lot of collaboration. And that's why I often set up something which I call a cross-data forum. So it's sort of teams like IT and change and business intelligence and business continuity, data protection, information security, op risk, those kinds of people, because very often you'll find synergies, or you'll be doing the same thing. Like, you'll probably all be planning training programs. Well, let's not go and use different terms and examples and confuse everyone and make them all feel frustrated with us, because why on earth didn't we all talk to each other? Or it does, I have to be honest, occasionally turn into a bit of a therapy group where we all go, the business doesn't understand us. But we'll all kind of come together and go, well, let's try it this way. Or I tried this and got a really great outcome. Or this person is really helpful in this team, go and talk to them. I mean, it's sort of, that's kind of a teaching grandma to suck eggs in terms of general collaboration. It's always helpful. So the next bit of the skills. So The enthusiasm and resilience, I'd say, are one of the most important skills. It takes a long time to do data governance. And that's why I do that subconscious association, as I said, in terms of if people associate me and my team with enthusiasm, then they're much more open when we go and talk to them. When they come into a meeting, they don't go, or they open an email from me, they don't go, oh, I'm hoping they go, oh, what sort of fun thing are they going to send me now? / oh, that's a fun picture as well, which you'll see my fun pictures in a minute. Engagement and influencing, definitely important skills, because of this top-down drive for a culture, you need to be completely comfortable talking to the CEO and all the execs together. And also with just general staff, they sometimes, as I say, people can feel like data governance is being done to them, whereas you really need to do it with them. And explain to them that you're not actually giving them more work to do. You're simply giving them a label for work they've already been doing. So most data stewards, when they're given that title, they don't do anything different. They're just given that title to go along with their normal job title, because they'll already be looking when the data quality is not right in a particular field. They're already the person who fixes it. They just haven't been given a label for that particular section in their job description. So personal impact and communication, this sort of harks back to the first two pairs. As with a lot of things in life, you need to be authentic, because you need to really get people's buy-in, and they need to believe that what you're doing isn't just sort of to please the regulator and say, look, we're doing data governance. It's real. We are actually bringing real benefit and showing them real examples of benefits. And you need to be able to communicate it. You can have all the subject matter expertise in the world, but if you can't communicate in sort of various different terms to lots of different departments and vary how you deliver it, it's the sell is just really hard. So problem solving and intermediary geek. So the reason I use intermediary geek is, I don't know if I invented it or it's a term I just use, because I've been searching for quite a while for a job that uses my tech understanding, but also my sort of communications side, my influencing and engagement skills, and sort of allows me to go between the two. And that's actually really important. You need to be able in data governance to have a fairly detailed conversation with a system owner about a fix, but then at the same time, do the training to anyone and in the business, and a new starter who's potentially just come out of uni and doesn't know any of the stuff about data or even how the company works. So bridging those gaps between the understanding, and also sometimes acting as a bit of a mediator, because the business department might be talking one language and IT will be talking another, and you can come as quite a useful intermediary with that as well. Problem solving, data governance is a lot about problem solving. Going back to the wardrobe analogy, what goes where when you're starting from scratch? What goes where in your nice organized wardrobe? How do you best protect your clothes from moths, for example? Does it make sense to put the shoes at the top or at the bottom? The belts and scarves go together, for example. Technological and business understanding, that harks back really to the previous two I was talking about. Because although I would say technological understanding is less important than you'd think in a job where you've got data in the title, the communication soft side skills are much more important. Because, for instance, I can't code. I know I could teach myself quite easily to do basic coding. I wouldn't have an issue with that. And I can have a fairly detailed conversation with people who can code to understand the fix necessary. But I need to be able to communicate that to the business. That's where I come in, and that's where I add more of the value. Then the external networking and continual development. Well, continual development we all want to do, hopefully, because it makes us better at our jobs and keeping up with best practice and things. But external networking, like things like this, is really important, because you can, as I said earlier, you can be quite lonely. You are often the only person in your company, and you're the only person with that kind of understanding of your specific discipline. And if you haven't got someone to talk to and bounce ideas off, it can be quite difficult. So I'm part of sort of general data meetup kind of groups, or I'm part of data governance specific ones. And sometimes I'll just ring up a fellow data governance person and say, can we have a Chatham House rules discussion? I really need to ask a question because I've not done this before, or I've tried this and it isn't working. What's worked for you, for example? So you'll be pleased I am nearly done. So these are one of my favorite pictures. The website is on the picture. This guy is amazing for data governance stuff. He does really great little videos and blogs. It's really accessible and bite-sized. It's not some of the books on data governance, even I don't bother reading because they're really quite hard going. And we're all really busy. We've only really got time to read blog posts and videos and things. But I do really love this because the fluffy data governance monster, it makes it more fun when data governance isn't a stick to hit people with, as I said earlier. It's there to help, and let the monster help you. He just wants a cuddle. Sorry, this is having the sort of little one in my house. Friends are visiting at the moment. And I've spent a lot of time. I remember on a previous meetup, we were all discussing in the chat about Paw Patrol. I think there's been quite a lot of similar things going on in my house this week. So yeah, so this is an effort, make it fun. I'm a great believer that professional doesn't equal boring in general. And data governance is there to help, and the benefits it can bring are huge. And it's also vital that as I said earlier, it's developed bespoke for each business to realize those benefits. You won't, if you try to cookie cutter, you won't get anywhere near as much benefit out of it. And finally, I'm very happy to take any and all questions, or I'm very happy to pop back to slides if I went too fast on something, or I didn't give enough detail or explain anything. Please shout.
That was a really brilliant talk, Helen. I do have one question. So aside from the fact it's brilliant, and aside from the fact I want to know more about the puppets, because that really intrigued me how you can do data governance with puppets. I think you made a really important point about somebody at the top of the organization needs to take ownership or take control of data governance. And, a lot of the organizations that I've worked with, I've spent a lot of time trying to convince people that somebody from the top needs to take ownership. And it's a really difficult thing to do. So what would your advice be to everybody out there to make the people that are kind of, holding the puppets, if you like, within that organization, take control and recognize data governance?
That is, I'll answer the puppet one very quickly first. Look up a guy called Scott Taylor called the Data Whisperer on LinkedIn. He's a genius. He did the 12 days of data governance, I think in December 2019, which was brilliant. But he also has puppets videos as well. Just check out his website. It's awesome. So, I mean, as I said earlier, data governance is hard. And it's being resilient and trying different ways. Don't keep bashing your head against a brick wall if one particular route isn't working. And so one of the things that I said earlier that I found works sometimes is the one-to-ones with the execs, to get them to understand why it's important. Get them in a room where they can just talk completely openly and in private with you about what their skill set level is around data. Why, and also you get that time with them to show them why it's important, and you take those examples that are bespoke for their area as to why it's important. I mean, it is harder in industries that are less regulated. I know I'm lucky having worked in medical research and in finance because they're quite heavily regulated sectors. And so sometimes the execs they do want you, or they know they have to do it because they'll get a big fine. But it's about demonstrating the benefits, and don't start with the difficult. Start with the easy. Start with the thing that's been bugging someone for months. and that you fix that little thing for them that means that a member of their staff doesn't have to run an exception report every morning and waste half a day's worth of effort. Go and get their "if you could fix this, I'd love you forever" list and see what you can fix. And then they'll see the benefits of data governance, and they'll see what benefits you could bring if you had more time and more resource and even dedicated people doing it. I mean, I used to have in the committee meeting, I would often have sort of a, well, what benefits have we achieved so far, even if they were little ones, like, well, we fixed the validation on that field, or we changed the drop down, or even we changed it to a drop down from a free text field, and now look at the how many fewer data quality issues we have, for example. So I would start small and work up, especially if you're not sort of if it's not your full-time day job like it is for someone like me. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does answer the question. I think the one-to-ones are very useful, and I've tried that in the past. The harder thing is not having a one-to-one, it's getting the exec team to turn up for one-to-ones, because they then think, well, what's that meeting in my diary? That's not very important. I'll just skip that one today.
Oh, I will also go and sit on their desk until they turn up. I have been known to do that. I genuinely have been known to sit on their chair until they come back from a meeting, and then they feel awfully guilty that they've left you waiting in a meeting room for 10 minutes.
Some very good tips here on how to handle exec committees, just generally as well. But now that did answer the question. It was a really useful talk.
You can also do something I call ninja training, which is you get an external person in to just come in for a chat with the exec. They don't realize that I've discussed with this external consultant everything that they're going to talk about, and basically done a training plan that they don't realize is a training plan. And they get trained stealthily and they don't realize it, which often works quite well. Because the thing, I'm never precious about the fact, I know I could train them, but they might not listen to me. But sometimes that externality factor sort of adds that authority level, and I'm fine with that. Whatever works and gets them on board, I don't care.
Sounds like you need to do a talk about how to deal with execs as well.
Well, I did also used to bribe doctors with cookies. I'm not lying either. I used to genuinely bribe them with cookies per piece of paper they did sometimes. But that doesn't work usually with executives, sadly. It does work with doctors. So if anyone works with a doctor.
Just from the data side, I hope it's not, look, doctor, I wouldn't mind some drugs for this particular ailment. Here's 10 cookies. Yeah, have whatever you want.
No, sadly they're not. No, I never managed to do that. No, only really worked for the paperwork they didn't want to do. Especially is when you make an error in medical research paperwork, you have to initial and date all those errors. And sort of, especially if they've just mixed the data, because you also have to usually have to put the date of birth of the patient, their patient's initials, and the date and today's date and the trial number for the patient at the top of every single piece of paper. And if you accidentally get today's date slightly wrong, they have to go and correct all of them and initial and date all of them. That's when the cookies really came out.
That's amazing. Thank you so much again. I'm going to go on mute and give other people a chance to talk as well.
Yes, please. If more of you have questions or are wondering how to apply this brilliant insight into your organization, please ask a question now and benefit from this brilliance.
I've got a question. Is there any sort of tools or frameworks that you use in your organization for data governance?
So there's quite a lot of resources that I do use.
That you have that.
So in terms of tooling, there is some some tooling out there that is getting sort of quite good. And initially, a lot of it was sometimes repurposed tooling. So it was sort of data protection tooling that had been repurposed, and they were trying to sell it to you as data governance tooling. It didn't always quite do what you wanted. So there are some really great companies out there like Informatica and Calibra, but that tends to need to be for bigger organizations because it does come with a bit of a price tag. And there is a lot out there, because you can get sort of data catalog tools that you can pay for, or you can build your own, because I know with previous meetup we've had some really great chats and presentations from people about data catalogs that they've built in particular pieces of software. So it's more what fits for the company, and you need to kind of look at what the company has got already as to what fits as well. I mean, that's usually a fairly standard answer for that kind of thing. I mean, there's some really great tools for data retention. So there's a tool called Varonis, which goes and scans all your unstructured data and tells you when it was last accessed, whether it contains personal data or not. You can then move it to a particular area and say, right, we're going to delete this after a year unless you go and retrieve it, for example. There's lots of great tooling out there that you can use to make it less of a manual process. Because if you said to everyone, well, you can't keep any emails for longer than 7 years, but we're going to make you go through all of them and delete them, you're never going to get staff to do that in a million years. So there is quite a lot of tooling out there that can make your life easier and quicker. I mean, the initial cleanup is often always bad, as it is in a lot of things, but the sort of the repeated activity of it can be a lot easier. But in terms of sort of resources and looking at things for sort of templates for people to get started. So the lady I mentioned, Nicola Ascombe, she's amazing. She's got loads of great blogs. There's also that Lights on Data website run by a guy called George. He also does a podcast as well. So that's got some really great resources. And also if you follow them on LinkedIn, you often find some great resources from what they look at and post about from other people as well. Is that what you meant, Ash?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And on the subject of data governance tooling, we have Nigel Jones here on the call. He is a developer with a IBM of the Egeria tool, and he writes into the chat, Helen, in case you didn't spot it. Superb talk, thanks, Helen. I felt it was an excellent introduction to the area. I work in data governance myself, so more on the open source development side, Egeria. Our project aims to help share metadata across the business. Yeah, Nigel, if you have more to say than that, feel free.
No, I mean, Egeria is another area that I've come across, which is really exciting, because metadata is another part that you can do with the data dictionary that I was talking about earlier, and it really does help because you can sort of tag the data, obviously lots of different ways, and it helps with all sorts of aspects. It helps with the level at which you govern the data. It helps with the level, how long you keep it for, because if you say, well, it's regulatory data, so we have to keep it for 10 years, or it's personal data, we can't keep it for longer than 7, for example. Yeah, no, tooling like that is amazing and so helpful.
Hi there, Helen. It's Nigel here. So I would wave, but the camera's playing up. Yeah, just to say, so I work on the open source project, Egeria. What I thought was really good about your talk actually is you're focusing on the principles and what's important about data governance. And sometimes I think we jump too quickly at what frameworks and what tools and stuff to use. So I think it's really, good to have that discussion first, and culture, etc., is so important as well. But yeah, if anyone's interested, we are working on an open source framework to try and help people at least capture the metadata that can then be consumed by some of these tools that do those other activities you need around data governance. So feel free to ping me if you have any questions. But thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. And well, that's what I wanted to do, because a lot of the time people sort of hope that they can run before they can walk, I think, and you've got to get the principles down. You can have the fanciest tools in the business in place in your company, but if you haven't got the right people to use them and your data is frankly a mess, you're not going to get any benefit from them other than you'll just get a whacking bill for a tooling set you can't use.